Today I'm reviewing the Polarpro Basecamp VND kit. This is a variable neutral density kit that comes with a matte box, which is this big square box that you can put over your lens. And I'll show you how you do that real quick. You take this screw-on accessory, screw this into your lens, as I'm about to do, and then you take your matte box, you screw it over the screw-on thing, and then you extend the flag. If you're unfamiliar with this flag and you're wondering what that does, well, basically it cuts flares. It creates a shadow that goes across the lens so that your light source doesn't create a flare in the lens. Now, a lot of cinematographers these days think flares are cool. You know, we intentionally have lens flares in our shots, so we may not want a matte box and a flag for those kinds of shots. But there are some shots where the flare just doesn't look good because it washes out the image completely. It kills your contrast in the image. And that's the kind of flare that you're going to want to cut with this flag. So this matte box system only has one flag, whereas other matte boxes might have 4 flags, which can cut light coming from any direction. So one hack for making this more usable is I found that if I adjust the angle of the flag like this as I'm shooting, then it can cut light that's coming from a weirder angle. What you see here in front of the lens right now is a circular polarizer, which basically just cuts out the reflections that you don't want in your shot. That's what a polarizer filter does. And the way you adjust it is with this ring right here. So as you turn the ring, you basically change the angle of reflection that you're affecting. But here's the magic trick. With this square filter, which is a neutral density filter, basically just makes the image darker, when you drop this in, it turns into a variable neutral density system. So the important thing to keep in mind here is that your 2 filters are now acting as one single variable neutral density. In case you're not familiar with what a variable neutral density filter does, it darkens the image gradually as you turn the filter. And this brings me to my first caveat with this system. If you don't need the matte box, then you might not need a big square variable neutral density because you can also get the circular kind that are much smaller. But let's say you do need a matte box. Well, this is a much smaller, lighter configuration than most matte box systems. It's supposed to be the lightest weight matte box, according to Polarpro's claims, on the market. And if you want to hot swap this between different camera systems or between different lenses, you can do it faster than most matte boxes, provided you have these mounts on each lens, because you can just slide it on like that, tighten it like that, boom, you got yourself a matte box and a variable ND. One thing you should know, if you already have square filters, this system isn't going to work with your existing filters. It's non-standard, it's proprietary to Polarpro. If you use rails, which I don't use, you can mount this matte box on rails. And there's also a special accessory that's sort of a rubber hood that goes between the lens and the matte box, which allows you to switch out your lenses without re-threading anything and without needing a threaded lens adapter. So basically, that rubber unit acts as a baffle to connect the matte box with your lens. So you can very quickly change out lenses, but you do have to be on rails for that. The system I chose to test this out with is the Sony a7 III and a 24 to 105 millimeter f4 zoom lens. And I chose this lens because this variable ND can only darken your image up to 5 stops, which means if I want to maintain a 1/50th shutter, the standard shutter speed, at f4, this is the appropriate variable ND to use. Because in broad daylight, I will only need to darken my image about 5 stops at the maximum. If I was using a wider aperture lens, like an f1.8 lens, then that adds a few more stops that I would need to darken the image in order to keep my shutter speed constant. In that case, I would need to use the 6 to 9 stop ND filter, which I do not have. So in case you're wondering about color shift or sharpness difference, here's a little comparison for you. Here's a shot that was done without the variable ND filter, and here's a shot with the variable ND filter at near maximum strength. So now you can compare the color without the variable ND and with the variable ND. And here's a zoomed in close-up so you can see the sharpness difference with the filter and without the filter. Okay, then I did a test of the matte box to see how effective it was at cutting flares. So here's a shot in backlight with the variable ND without the matte box. As you can see, the flare pretty much washes out the whole shot. Now here's a shot with the matte box cutting the flare. A lot more contrast comes back into the image. But here's the kicker. Here's a shot with no matte box and no variable ND. The lens itself is actually pretty good at eliminating flares. So one thing I noticed right away as soon as I had this rigged up is that it is heavier. It makes the whole camera heavier, more front heavy. I found myself not wanting to hold the camera like this anymore. I held it more like this, where I used one hand on the balance point where the weight was even. And then this hand is just offering guidance. Holding it like this, I was actually able to get pretty steady handheld shots. The front and the back sort of act as, I don't know, counterweights to each other, I guess, and they reduce the amount of wobble that you end up seeing in the shot. Another trick I tried out while I was shooting was an exposure rack. So this is where I changed the variable ND strength in the middle of the shot while I was shooting. Basically what you do is you use the right hand to turn the filter, and you try to do it as smoothly as possible while you're holding the camera with the left hand. The way I would have achieved that shot without a variable ND filter is to use either shutter priority, where the aperture adjusts automatically, or manual mode with automatic ISO. So either the aperture would have adjusted itself automatically or the ISO would have adjusted automatically. But why is this not a perfect solution? Well, in this particular shot, Kobe walked in front of a bright window before arriving at the window at the end of the shot. So that bright window in the middle of the shot would have caused the camera to darken the image significantly right at that moment, which I don't want. Kobe's face should remain properly exposed throughout the shot. So I had to do it manually. Now, admittedly, this would have been easier using a circular filter instead of a square filter, because with the square filter, I can only turn it a little bit at a time, like that, because that's just the way it's built. Whereas if I had a true circular filter here, I could turn the whole filter as much as I wanted, then I would be able to make much larger adjustments to the exposure all at once. Now, I haven't tested this at all on a gimbal because in most cases, I just wouldn't want this extra size and weight when I'm shooting on gimbal, period. There's one more drawback or advantage, depending on how you look at it, to this system, which is that when you put the matte box in here, this looks a lot more professional. Now, let's say you're shooting for a client, and the client's looking at your camera, engaging your professionality based on how your camera looks. Well, then it's an advantage because your client now looks at your A7 III and says, wow, that's a real cinema camera. It looks like a real camera, right? But if you're shooting in public, in a space where they might ask you for a permit or other permission to film there, and you don't have one, now it's a liability. You might get kicked out a lot more easily, or you might have people just staring at your camera a lot more because you have this big square box in the front of it and it looks a lot more professional. So here's my overall breakdown. If you're trying to be as small and as light as possible, and you're trying to shoot incognito and not be noticed, then you probably don't want to use the Basecamp system. However, if you want a matte box that's hot swappable between lenses, then this does make sense because it is smaller and lighter than comparable matte box systems and square filter systems. So that's my review of the Polarpro Basecamp system. If you decide this is too big and bulky and you want a circular variable ND instead, Polarpro does have a circular variable ND. Just go check it out on their website. All right, I will see you in the next video.